Good evening, everyone. My name is Geetika Gopi, and I'm a privacy engineering graduate student at CMU. Today, I'll be discussing about the privacy requirements and realities of digital public goods, also called as DPGs. This research is in collaboration with my classmate Adya Madhi and under the guidance of Professor Julia Fanti. So digital ID is just one example. More broadly, digital public goods are defined as open source software, open data, AI models, standards, and content that must adhere to privacy, applicable laws, follow best practices, and ensure they do no harm. In 2019, the UN published a report that called for a multi-stakeholder alliance to establish a platform for sharing digital public goods, or DPGs. This recommendation also emphasized that DPGs must safeguard user privacy. And so the DPG Alliance was formed to facilitate the discovery, development, use of, and investment in digital public goods. Today, most national ID systems are implemented by the private sector. This has many benefits, but it has also led to problems like vendor lock-in, poor interoperability, and high costs for adopting governments. A growing trend in the digital ID space, which is fueled in part by international development organizations, is to instead adopt open source solutions. For example, MOSIP is an open source digital ID solution that has been adopted by several countries around the world. MOSIP and other open source solutions solve problems to digital public infrastructure and are known as digital public goods. Because of these benefits, DPGs are starting to be adopted by sovereign governments across the world to manage critical infrastructure, including digital identity systems, health information systems, open source software for financial services in countries like Philippines and Morocco. So to attain a DPG status, candidates undergo a review against the so-called DPG standard. Once approved, they are added to the DPG registry, which means they are added to the DPGA's website and GitHub repository. Today, there are about 100 DPGs in total. Because of DPGs used in critical government services, their use can also present privacy risks. These risks arise because DPGs collect, process, and store sensitive personal information such as health data, financial information, and digital identity records. To address these privacy risks, the DPG Alliance has developed a standard and a questionnaire. The evaluation approach requires the applicant to answer the following questions: whether the solution collects and processes PII data, what type of PII data will be collected, and how does the solution ensure data privacy and security. And it's clear here that privacy is used as a broad umbrella term. This may result in vague responses about the privacy practices of potential DPG candidates. And this led to our research question: is the current approach effective in evaluating digital solutions for potential privacy harms? We conducted an exploratory and qualitative analysis of the DPG responses. After familiarizing ourselves with the 101 responses, we proceeded to identify initial themes and patterns within them. Each theme was assigned a code, leading to the development of the initial codebook. To ensure intercoder reliability, we enlisted the expertise of 2 coders who tested the codebook and made necessary updates to the codes. We studied the following questions: what were the different types of mechanisms proposed by DPGs to protect user privacy? What were the types and quality of supporting documentation submitted? The overall response quality? And a component analysis to assess the extent to which these responses address the various aspects of user privacy. Before summarizing our overall results, I wanted to start with a few example responses from the DPGs. DPG-1 primarily discusses security controls such as strong password rules, but does not discuss data-focused strategies for safeguarding PII data. DPG-2 provides a vague response and references terms like an in-house data protection system without clarifying its specific functionalities. DPG-3 mentions a data protection law without providing sufficient details. These examples already illustrate the significant gap between the candidate's understanding of privacy and the expectations from an evaluator's perspective. Now for a more systematic description of our findings. Strikingly, over 50% of the DPGs did not submit any supporting documentation to explain their protection mechanisms. Somehow, they still managed to pass the DPG standard check. And only about 16% of the DPGs submitted some form of documentation related to security or privacy. The remaining DPGs submitted privacy policies, cookie policies, or compliance-related documentation. This raises an interesting question. Do the DPGs assume that privacy compliance is equivalent to privacy protection? We did, in fact, investigate this further in the subsequent sections of our analysis. When we assessed the overall quality of the responses, we found that many DPGs lack specificity when describing their protection methods. This could be attributed to the open-ended nature of the questionnaire. Additionally, most DPGs seem to focus primarily on security-related privacy controls like encryption or regulatory measures as their main strategies for ensuring privacy. Surprisingly, they tended to overlook data-oriented strategies like data minimization and anonymization. It is interesting to note that approximately 1/4 of the responses took steps that fully or partially address privacy by design principles. On the flip side, we did encounter several responses that revealed a lack of understanding of privacy by design. Some DPGs seemed inclined to shift the responsibility for privacy to solution implementers using statements like, we do not own the data, and others downplayed the risks, suggesting that there is no guaranteed way to protect user data or stating that complete privacy is a myth. We conducted a privacy coverage analysis by extracting common components from several key privacy principles. And in the graph, the horizontal bars represent these common components, while the vertical bars indicate the percentage of DPGs that address each specific component. We define addressing a component as including some amount of documentation describing their efforts related to that component. The results indicate that most of the components do not achieve a satisfactory coverage rate. However, the component that received the most attention was security safeguards, followed by regulatory efforts. This reinforces our previous finding that DPGs often mistake privacy protection for security safeguards and compliance efforts. Furthermore, the results also highlight that DPGs do not place enough emphasis on addressing user notice, choice, and control. The results also highlight that Finally, we examined the technical documentation of several well-known DPGs to identify privacy risks. To achieve this, we created data flow diagrams and applied the Linden threat modeling approach. The case study presented on this slide focuses on a well-known DPG, a national identity system with over 93 million users. The documentation, which was also used for the DPG standard, suggests the following issues. The system placed and assumed trust in relying parties for ID verification, potentially exposing sensitive data of residents. The system uses a data anonymization method called suppression, which could be vulnerable to inference attacks. The documentation stated the presence of unencrypted databases containing PII data without providing a clear justification. The documentation also lacked clear and well-defined data retention and deletion policies, especially for sensitive PII data like biometrics. Finally, we identified concerns related to consent quality, as system operators could mark consent on behalf of the users. We've communicated these issues with the parent organization of the DPG, and they have suggested that most of these do not reflect the actual code implementation, but rather an artifact of incomplete documentation. They have committed to correcting these documentation issues. However, this example underscores the importance of clear and transparent documentation to ensure that a DPG candidate does in fact protect its users' privacy. Based on our research findings, we identified two potential approaches to address these issues. The DPG Alliance could consider revisiting the privacy questionnaire to make the following improvements: clearly defining categories of PII data for candidates to select from, rather than requiring an open-ended input, specifying the accepted and suggested types of documentation for each section, and ensuring a thorough description of privacy and security safeguards by including dedicated sections for privacy. This approach remains applicable even if there are overlaps between security and privacy. Alternatively, it would be beneficial to consider whether the DPG Alliance is the appropriate entity to evaluate DPGs for privacy risks. The privacy industry has made significant strides in developing adaptable privacy frameworks and principles such as the NIST privacy framework and the APC information principles instead of rigid standards. It is unclear why the DPG Alliance, which is neither a technical standard setting body nor a privacy auditor, should be responsible for evaluating privacy practices. To conclude, we find that the state of privacy practices and evaluation in DPGs leaves much room for improvement. We would love to discuss any suggestions for encouraging a more widespread adoption of privacy best practices in the world of DPGs. Thank you.